My topic for this project, as Professor Murphy stated, is Queen Elizabeth, and I entitled it The Heart of a King and the Body of a Woman, a historiographical study of feminist interpretations of Queen Elizabeth I. And I basically went into this wanting to look at how traditional historians represented Elizabeth and how that compared to feminist historians. So I first looked at traditional to get a background and a basis of how Elizabeth is presented in history. The first historian I looked at was Paul Johnson, and he did a biography on Queen Elizabeth entitled Elizabeth I. And he actually doesn't spend a whole lot of time on Elizabeth. He spends only a chapter on the marriage and the debate of marriage. And he actually states the reasoning for Elizabeth remaining unmarried until death was she had a deep dislike of marriage. She liked kind of the idea of talking about it. She liked the idea of talking about courtship. She surrounded herself with handsome, intelligent men, but she didn't like the idea of marriage. She had the potential, Johnson states, of losing her power on the throne if she took a husband, because as a woman, the man kind of had the potential of taking over her power as a woman and also on the throne. Elizabeth also discusses, or Johnson discusses, Elizabeth as the Virgin Mary. So how she's represented as kind of a religious figure. And this is a quote from his book. He describes her as a transcendental object of sexuality, as well as a surrogate Virgin Mary, biblical Deborah, and other quasi-religious symbols. So Elizabeth, with the cut from Rome, England's cut from Rome and Catholicism no longer present in England, there was kind of a opening, you could say, and Elizabeth kind of took over the religious symbol of Virgin Mary by being the quote-unquote Virgin Queen. There are some problems with Johnson and his interpretation, and a lot of it comes from his biases. And he was writing in 1970, I think 1973 I believe was his book, and so that's at the time where the feminist movement had been kind of already established for about a decade, and a backlash had been created or had kind of emerged against women who participated in the feminist movement. They were often deemed basically raw, burning man-haters. And in this quote, these feminine tricks, there were no women's lib inhibitions about Elizabeth, were highly effective and frequently used. Here he's describing how Elizabeth used her feminine wiles to control the court, to control kind of the men in court and get what she wanted done. But the problem with this is twofold. It shows his biases against the feminist movement and women who participated in that. And it also presents an idea that Elizabeth would not have had as a queen in the 16th century. She would not have thought about not using her assets, not using her sex to get what she wanted done. It would have been natural for her to use kind of her feminine traits, and it would have been completely foreign to her to kind of push against the norms of femininity. So the next historian I look at is John King and his article, Queen Elizabeth I, Representations of the Virgin Queen. And here, he actually argues against historians like Johnson, and he argues against this idea that by Elizabeth remaining unmarried, she actually was pushing against some type of patriarchal convention and pushing against the system by remaining unmarried. But he actually states that Elizabeth had to be very cautious with who she married, and she tried on several accounts to marry and constantly was reminding her parliament or reassuring her parliament that she would in fact marry. But she had to be very kind of choosy with who she chose, because England was just achieving peace, just getting some stability of about it. And if she chose someone of the wrong religion, she would create kind of a portion of her population would be upset by this. If she chose the wrong aristocratic bloodline, she ran that risk. If she married in England, and then she had seen the mistakes that her father and her sister had made, and if you know anything about Henry VIII, he had 6 wives, so obviously he's not the best. They were just really excited to get rid of Mary. Mary's reign had been a very trying time for England. She's called Bloody Mary for a reason, and so Doran says that they weren't so much concerned of having another queen, so it wasn't her gender that was the issue. They were just really excited to get rid of Mary. And what she fails to mention is that her taking of the throne was by no means easy. England was in debt, religion still hadn't been dealt with, so there were a lot of these things that were going on that her taking the throne were not easy. And there were critics, and she pushes them to the fringe of society and dismisses them because of it. And despite the fact that Elizabeth actually does something about these critics, she deals with critics of female rule, like I had said earlier, and by kind of dismissing the fact that there were critics, dismisses a population that were concerned about having another female ruler. She also uses this idea that female rule was no novelty in Europe at the time. There had been several queens, several regents. However, these women had blood ties to the throne. They had legal, legitimate claims to the throne, and that's why they were accepted. They were accepted because they were part of the monarchy. And they had also been educated almost in preparation to be on the throne, or to support someone who was on the throne, a male relative. It would only be until women were given the same resources and education as men that non-monarch women would take leadership positions. So my conclusions. In doing this paper, I've learned a lot about Elizabeth, but I've also learned a lot about history and historians. And one of the things that you kind of know, but it's not something you really focus on, is the fact that historical decisions are not simple. Decisions are not simple. Factors, different factors, varying factors go into this, and it's true with Elizabeth. And comparing a specific issue that Bassnett and Doran both discuss is actually a really good way to kind of represent this. They both talk about Elizabeth's decision to take the title Supreme Governor of the Church instead of Supreme Head of the Church, which I believe her father had originally declared himself as. And Bassnett sees it as a gender issue, that both the Protestants and the Catholics were hesitant to make Elizabeth the head of the church because she was a woman. And women historically are not supposed to have power within the church. They're not supposed to be leaders in the church. It's a very patriarchal institution. So they were hesitant to name her head of the church, so she instead took the title Supreme Governor. Doran, on the other hand, looks at it from a specifically religious aspect. She believes that the head of the church is God, and that title, Supreme Head, should just be for God. And that the proper title for the human head of the church on earth is Supreme Governor. But they both have validity in their statements. They both have reasoning that is sound. They both have evidence to back them up. So why can't both of them be right? Why is one right and the other one is wrong? And I think kind of by comparing them and seeing that Elizabeth was a complex person. She had different factors. She had to be constantly aware of different things. And I think, personally, I think both of those factors contributed to her decision. And by dismissing one or the other, you lose a chance to enrich the subject and get kind of a more complete picture of Elizabeth. I kind of see it as like a puzzle. Each historian brings the topic, a specific piece of the puzzle, and once we kind of determine what the piece is and where it goes, we'll get a more complete picture of a historical figure, and specifically Elizabeth. Now, along with this, historians need to kind of recognize the biases that they go into each project with, because we, as humans, as people, have different perspectives by nature. We experience different events, we get different education, we have different families, so we bring to the table different ideas and different approaches of looking at things, which is great. It can enrich a subject, it can provide new light on a subject, but it can also hinder a historian too, because it can limit their interpretation and